Hey everybody, Justin here.
Hey, Eric here. How you doing?
Well, just oh my script went away. I get these computer notifications out of the blue. Like I just got one on my computer that's just like new features in Ventura. You're like, yeah, great.
Oh,
Thanks for
yeah.
letting me know. I updated like 3 days ago.
Yep.
Um, anyways, we're Sonic Boom Live. Uh, if you're here, you probably already know what we are. But if you're new, Sonic Boom Live is a sort of podcast-ish webcast where Eric here and I, who are video game veterans, talk about video game news, usually the hottest topics of the week, but topics that specifically focus on video game industry and the trends and things that are going on in it. So for us, it tends to be stuff that's less about like buzzworthy game stuff and more about changes in the way the game industry is kind of mutating over time, or marketing stuff that may have double meanings or law legal suits that may have a large impact on the game industry as a whole. So that's kind of what we cover. This week, what are the topics that we'll be covering, Eric?
We're going to talk about Sega. Interestingly, they have promised a super game, and we're going to talk about that a bit. This isn't the first time it's been sort of publicly announced, but it is something. There's a new bit of information that came up, so we're going to discuss
Yeah.
it. PlayStation VR2 has now a release date and a
Price.
price. Yes, and we're going to talk almost less about the price and release date and more about the way that Sony has been communicating about
Yes.
this. And then finally, Square Enix Montreal, the studio formerly known as Square Enix Montreal, was one of the studios that was sold to Embracer Group earlier this year, I believe. And that studio has now been shuttered. We're going to discuss how that happened, why that happened, presumably. We're not given too much information, but we have some insight as to what might be going on in the Embracer Group higher up, the upper echelon of that company
Mm.
in determining a forward strategy and what this might mean for the overall game industry and the current economy and everything. So
Yeah.
we'll dive into that a bit.
All right. So yeah, if you guys like this type of content and you like what we're doing, please like and subscribe to our channel. It does help us out. It does help us understand what content works and what doesn't work. And I think there's an algorithm that probably enjoys it too. But for us, it's mostly understanding what kind of content people want to see. Also, feel free to comment. We do respond to things in time, so please do that. But let's get on with the actual content of this show. So let's first cover Sega and their kind of pivot towards this
Super game.
super game
Oh
strategy that
boy.
they've been talking about since like April this year. In
Yeah.
reality, I think it was April this year where they're
I think
like,
so.
"Hey, we're gonna make super games, and we are aiming to do 5 of them at a minimum." Um, just kind of like a weird thing to announce in general. But I
Yeah.
guess I can go over this part of it, and Eric, I'll probably ask you some questions, and we'll talk about it some more. So,
Sure.
if you're not familiar with Sega, and I don't know how you would be enjoying the video game industry without knowing who they are, they're the company behind, the Sega Genesis, the Dreamcast, Sonic the Hedgehog, and a bunch of other actually really great titles that most got airtime and people's attention like up to the Dreamcast era. After the Dreamcast era, when they kind of said, "Hey, we're going to be publisher only," um, their most like known franchises now are like Yakuza. The Sega Group also owns Sammy, which makes Guilty Gear. Um, so and they publish Sonic the Hedgehog games. I think the most recent one being I don't remember the name of that actually. It's their
It
open
depends.
world adventure game.
Yeah,
It's called
that's fair. Yeah,
Frontiers.
I think yeah, yeah. There, it sort of also depends on what platform you're talking about because they've had a number of mobile Sonics as well that have come out.
I think
Uh,
every mobile Sonic has made it onto consoles digital. So like they had like
at this
Sonic
point,
Mania, yeah, like those, and actually Sonic Mania was really amazing. Not developed by like Sega actually. Sonic Mania, you know, in like a weird twist, kind of like how we got a good Sonic movie instead of a disturbing Sonic movie, is they went to people who had been working on building like fan versions of Sonic games, and said, "Hey, can you develop
An official one.
an official Sonic game?" Yeah, and they did, and we got Sonic Mania out of it, which is like a throwback to 2D Sonic games that were on the Genesis. Um, so we got that out of that team, but not developed by Sega actually. Um, yeah, so like Sega's been struggling. I think they acknowledge that they've been struggling. They still make money. I think through a lot of their Japanese side of things, and Yakuza doing as well as it does. But they don't actually have any like big games. And as a major publisher, it's kind of a weak point of theirs. So much so that since like 2015, they've been talking about restructuring to try to get Sega's strength back, which has not yet happened. Like Yakuza continues to perform, but they still struggle to make a decent Sonic game, which I don't get, but whatever. They have.
Well,
What was that?
I think it may be related to the fact that they seem to keep wanting to try to iterate on game mechanics and take Sonic in a direction that is not Sonic. It started in the Dreamcast era with like Mario style platformer mechanics instead of Sonic style, like focus on speed.
Yeah, that and like I think like I don't know. I mean, like I don't want to like dog on
Dig into that, sure.
because it's like I think you can just look at the review scores and be like, Sega has a lot of trouble publishing games that are really strong with a fan base. Like people clearly want a good Sonic game, but they struggle to produce one year after year. And every time they create a new Sonic game that has like a new weird quirk, it will sell, but it alienates like a large fan base. It's just like, what the heck? And they've thrown a bone to like people like you and I who play the 2D games and gave us Sonic Mania and a couple others, but they've really struggled to make a 3D Sonic game that is new to like a brand new audience that really both reviews well and appeals to a wide audience, which it actually seems to be what they're talking about in this like idea of a super game.
Yeah.
So in April last year they announced they were going to be doing this. It was like a sort of pivot. It's the language around it that's the strangest.
Yes.
But we'll talk about that briefly. Their goal is to make a game that would have a far higher adoption rate than the previous games, which, yeah, of course. Right. Like that's going to be the goal of every game. This would be achieved through innovations that their current games are missing. Right. Yeah. They also said this is achievable by creating a game that has community support through streamers and people who view those streams to create a community supported game. Again, like this seems like what everybody is trying to do anyways. That anybody that's at least trying to create a massive game. Yeah. I already talked about the restructuring, and this was all stated in their Sega Sammy 2022 corporate report. Anything else to add there, Eric?
Yeah, there were a couple other things, or at least one major one. They said that it was super weird, but it was basically that they were claiming that the super game would be built on a amalgamation of all of Sega's technology. They didn't say IP, right? They said technology. So their core technology, whatever they didn't define it. They just said our technology we're going to bring together, and in using cloud. And at one point they were even sort of throwing out the maybe about NFTs being a part of it.
That was mentioned as part of their super game. Like, it's like a strange like corporate messaging coming from them.
Yes.
I think additionally, like if we look at the like stable of Sega games that they could be borrowing technology from, is like of course there's like technological developments in game design that are software systems, but there's also like PSO, like Phantasy Star Online, which I think it still continues to exist in some form, today,
They may be
but has
genuine.
largely not been able to blow up like a lot of other massive, online RPGs. And the original PSO started out, I think, the Dreamcast days,
Yeah.
where that was the first go into it, and it had moderate support, but never really grew. Other than that, fighting game systems, driving games, and Yakuza's RPG systems, all of which are like, yeah, those are all technologies and whatnot, but maybe there's other technologies that they have as part of like a Japanese company that may or may not be dwelling in things or be dealing in things other than game systems. Like, you may have an understanding of this, but I know Sega, like a lot of Japanese companies, are usually not pigeonholed into one type of tech. Does Sega have like diversity in Japan, like other services and tech support that aren't specifically games?
They they I want to say they did. I feel like we might have actually talked about this slightly. There was one of the major game center companies.
Konami.
So was it
I think
Konami?
we're
They
talking about
sold
Konami.
off. They
Oh,
yeah they sold off their arcade their game center stuff and to focus on I think gyms or something. They've been Konami.
yeah,
So the fun part is in Japan, game centers are arcades as we know them in the
yeah,
West. Um, Game centers are usually they frequently run by the major publishers out of Japan. Like I think there's the Namco. I think Namco has game centers. I'm pretty sure Konami definitely does. Sega for sure. And they have Sega in particular has a big arcade game wing where they have. I want to say it's their AM2 boards were back in the day. Like that
yeah.
was the
That back in the
technology.
Sega Saturn game that day, they
Right.
had an AM2 board.
Yep. Yep. And then the Dreamcast had an equivalent version. The idea there was that they could make these arcade games and then port them relatively easily to the home console because that was sort of the conversation back in the 90s was arcade games and console games, and that was sort of the conversation. Why go to the arcade and keep throwing quarters on it when you can buy it once and then play it as much as you want?
Yeah,
So that ended, of course, when Sega pulled out of the home console market and started just becoming a publisher. But they were still and still are active in making arcade games, at least in Japan, for the game centers. And I think maybe to a very limited sort of boutique version here in the United States, where you might go to like a huge multiplex movie theater, and while you're waiting, they have like one or two arcade cabinets that are around. I think those may be partially created by them. At any rate, so Sega is diversified in that way. They also have a few sort of free-to-play mobile apps. They do, as you mentioned, still have Phantasy Star Online 2. Apparently, it seems to still be running.
yeah.
But nothing is the big thing. Like you have in the West, we have Activision Blizzard that have multiple huge titles. There's Ubisoft has multiple huge titles. EA, multiple huge titles. Bandai Namco, multiple huge titles. Capcom, huge titles. These are all huge money makers for those companies. And Sega is like, we have Sonic, and to a lesser extent, Persona, and these are games that have found a niche that are popular enough to float a sizable company.
Right, right.
But
It's like
they're
consistently sizable enough to float the company, but no one game has actually had that like outsized effect on the company like Take-Two has with Grand Theft Auto or Capcom has with Resident Evil, etc.
right. And it's not something they can turn into a game as a service that is a huge moneymaker that they can just say like, great, this is now the backbone moneymaker for the company. We have a growth strategy, the stuff that investors want to hear. And it's very, very part of why we're highlighting this is because the slide that Sega showed basically says like, yeah, here we're going to have our standard IP games, and here's our expected like revenue curve from those, which is the optimistic upwards trend. And then they show this other like impact that sort of suddenly goes like dramatically more vertical, where they say this is the effect of super game, and you're like, you've given us no information. They're like, we're just going to make a big game that appeals to a lot of people. You're like,
yeah,
isn't that sort of the point of all the games?
Yeah,
major
I mean, like, I think this is
publisher.
why it's making news, and I'm
Yeah.
torn between understanding if this is like just them going to their investors, like, look, we're pivoting, and we're going to try to do what everybody else has been doing, and we
Right.
think we can because we have technology and IP that's going to help us get there,
Yeah.
or it's them like acting as if they've invented something new, and they're like, because, and I think this is part of the reason why they call it super game and why it might be throwing people off, is it sounds like they're like come up with this novel concept of creating this super title
Mhm.
uh, that does exactly what any other large video game has managed to do.
It, yeah, it also doesn't help that their messaging has been super vague and simultaneously self-contradicting. As you mentioned, they did say like 5 games we're going to be working on in this space
Yeah,
in their super game framework. But then later on, when they message it, it says we're going to have one game that is a huge hit that grows and it becomes a service, right? That's sort of
right.
the language of their announcement. And so I guess you could reconcile those two things by saying they're going to try to have 5 different services. They'll start small and then figure out through survival of the fittest which one the player base backs most,
Right,
and then back that one. Put all energy into the one that survived the gauntlet.
yeah,
But that seems sort of weird because theoretically you'd be targeting different audiences with different games. So, you know,
yeah,
I, it, it's it's sort of confusing. At the same time, this might, as you were pointing out, be just a change for them and say, hey, look, we're calling it super game, but that's because of the scale that we're shooting for. And simultaneously, by announcing that they want to entice streamers, that they want to have streamers and players working side by side and have sort of this network effect of word of mouth improvement of people glomming on and joining into the fun, that it may be that for them, they're looking at this as service first instead of game mechanics first, which
yeah.
Sega is a traditional developer and publisher. That's historically what they've done. So it's almost for them, as you were suggesting, Justin. It may be that they're trying to, without giving away any information about what they want to do with the game, explain that there is this strategic pivot in how they
Right.
approach game development.
Like, I want to believe that their management isn't that daft with like their messaging,
Yeah,
but
but
also it's Sega, and Sega's been daft with their development for like years. So it's like
yeah, that's
that's the thing. I think that people are like, either they're giving a funny name to a company wide initiative to try to pivot and recapture some of their success, uh,
yeah.
or it really is that daft. And it's like, I think the problem is like people are like, it could be either, and the way they message it doesn't really lead us to believe it's one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. You want to hope that that's the case, and maybe it is. At the same time, they drop lines like, we're going to have a super revolutionary, this is going to be built on the back of a super revolutionary game system and mechanic. Now, that could be very vague. Maybe they're talking about some new networking thing that, who knows? I can't imagine anything in the tech sector right now that would power something like that.
Right.
But
That Sega would leave the development on in the first place.
yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
no, you'd expect it to come from something like Microsoft.
Yeah, or Google, if they got bored with Stadia and decided they found another fun toy they wanted to play with, they throw their oodles of ad dollars at that.
Yeah.
So but that aside, this sounds like someone who's never actually made a game looking and saying, I know how to make a great game.
Yes.
You do it. You can't do what everyone else did. You have to make something revolutionary. That's our strategy. Like,
Yeah, right.
what?
And, I mean, that's how it reads too, and you're just like, is this lost in translation? Like, what's going
Yeah.
on here?
Yeah. It's like,
I think like my core issue with it is like, and this is kind of, we had this discussion, which is few games from a top down approach that hasn't had like a pedigree with it
mhm.
finds large success.
Yeah.
And like, this goes to say, like, it's like, yeah, you can look at like Grand Theft Auto and you're like, how stupidly successful that is. You're like, yes, but Grand Theft Auto is not fundamentally a different game than Grand Theft Auto 3, right?
Yeah.
It's advanced over whatever it is, 10 years, 12 years.
More than that now.
Yeah, it really is more than that. But like, like, yeah, I guess it's when I was in college, like 20 years of developing that and adding online features and evolving those things off of that. And that's how you end up with the Grand Theft Auto that can sell 120 million copies
Yeah.
and have like a huge following behind it. And it's like, what does Sega have that really is that like seed that can evolve into a game that's massively popular, like popular? Like, I don't know what that would be, or what game you could say it's going to be modeled off for this. For them, like Yakuza is the only thing that stands out, and even that's a single player RPG. Like, could they turn that into like a, I don't know, a cyberpunk scale online game? Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. That's sort of the thing, right? Like, um, the other ways that you mentioned that the pedigree is really helpful, and that can be either the pedigree of the developer or the pedigree of the IP. With the IP as an example, we have World of Warcraft, which came out and exploded. Day one, they sold out of everything effectively, and had, the servers went down because it was too popular.
Yeah.
And then of course they kept iterating and sold tens of millions of more subscriptions, but that did not appear out of nowhere. It had used the Warcraft IP, which was already super popular because of the previous, Warcraft 1, 2, and 3. It also was built by Blizzard, who had a major history of nailing it out of the park with every game they made, at least from the Warcraft 2 era. And then, what was the other one that we chatted about? You did mention Grand Theft Auto, which had, Grand Theft Auto 1 and 2, of course, then 3 when it went 3D.
3D, yeah.
Yeah, and then
progressively
4
from
and
every
5.
game they're on. I think it was like Grand Theft Auto 4 was offline, like didn't have an online component, but I want to say 5 is what added the online aspect of it, and it's grown out this entire thing based off of that.
Then there was Destiny. That's another one we can think of where it's been really popular. Destiny 1 and 2, and those were developed by Bungie, who had made Halo and had done the first 3 or 4 Halo games,
which were not unpopular games.
Right.
And so, not only that, it had like one of the first really stable online experiences. So it's like,
yeah,
I mean, it's the reason why Sony bought Bungie in the first place. It's like, you have a large pedigree behind making very successful, massive multiplayer online games.
As a side note, they also, I don't know of a Sony. I mean, Killzone, I think, was it the last Sony game, first party? Was it first party? It was like a first-person shooter game.
Party, but what about that?
Just first-person shooter. Sony doesn't really have a first-person shooter.
No, yeah, Killzone's probably the closest one, or like Resistance.
Resistance, that was the other one. Right. Yeah. So like those two, but they haven't had a release in those IPs in forever. And with I think you're right. There's no sign that Sony has said to Bungie, stop on working on your already massively successful Destiny 2. Like, keep that going.
Yeah.
But there may be a thing where they're like, we've seen this before from Sony, where they bring in experts from one company to help another company. There may be a thing where like, well,
or
we also get the first.
We're going to use your backbone tech for that you're using for Destiny to build a new IP off of that.
Right. So Sony might have a super game coming too.
Sony is talking about having a super game. Like, this is
that Jade Raymond's studio
initiative of theirs. So it's like exactly what Sega says, except Sony bought Bungie and has a stable of developers that are all.
Wasn't that sort of Jade Raymond's studio purpose?
Jade Raymond's studio. Naughty Dog's working on it, and then I think there's a third studio that's working on another massive like online game that's supposed to turn into something.
And not Naughty Dog's. That's the Last of Us Part 2, or
it's
the Last of Us multiplayer thing, right?
Yes.
It's like a
Factions, but I don't think it's actually called Factions.
It's whatever
it's supposed to be like Factions was.
Right. Yeah. Which Factions was the sort of expansion to Last of Us Part 1.
Yes,
the online
the online multiplayer aspect of it. So they're clearly like aiming to balloon that out to see if they can create like a hit on their hands.
Yeah.
They're Sega's making statements like Sony could.
Right.
But Sony has like all the resources to make that sort of statement. You go, okay, like they're pivoting to really focus on a massive multiplayer game that, you know, could rival, I don't know, PUBG or something.
Yeah.
Where Sega just making that statement, you're like, that's great and all, but how do you expect to do that from a top down? And I think what it reeks of is like that sort of, you see this in a lot of Japanese companies. You see it, and I've worked with a lot of tech companies at the time where a company that's built by engineers thinks they can engineer solutions to every problem. And you're like, yes, you technically can. But if your intent is to solve something like player stickiness, you're like, I don't know how you do that. It's not something that you can just engineer a solution to. It's something you have to iterate on to develop. And none of your current IP really shows that you have that base tech that really works well, that you could turn into a massive multiplayer game, and it would make sense in that space. Like I said, Yakuza makes the most sense, and Yakuza is a single player game that you might be able to turn into an online game, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it could be that they're trying to develop a whole new IP for that, but it is doubly hard to do new IP, new game, revolutionary mechanic, and you know, put all that together. This feels to me very much like, it's not the exact same thing, but there's the underpants gnomes thing where it's like, step 1, build a great game. Step 2, step 3, profit. And like exactly. Step 2 is just question marks. Like
step 2 is the hardest part.
Right, exactly. They just don't. We're gonna skip that. We're gonna assume so. Sega's slide says assume that we're gonna be able to make an amazing game.
Right. But I mean, like, you even think about it, like from the studio that brought you Sonic Frontiers, that's like mildly accepted, right? Like, you're like, okay, from the studio that brought you PlayStation or like Phantasy Star Online 2. Like, none of those are going to, like, drum up the sort of attention you need to, like, step out of the gate with something that attracts attention, and then you can start playing with that audience to see what works and what doesn't. So I really have no idea. Like I said, like, the only game I can think of is, like, Yakuza, and maybe Persona, but even Persona has quite a niche following behind it.
It does, because I've never played a Persona game. I've looked at a bunch of trailers, and it's sort of like head scratching. You're like, well, I think it's very much a psychological game. The idea, my understanding is, it goes into the psyche of characters in the game, and you're like warping through weird spaces and abstract spaces as a result of that.
Yeah, and
that's the play space, and like that just to me doesn't feel like it has the legs to go super like right, like to hit a mass market. I don't know.
I mean, and if they're trying to iterate to create something that does work, like, you'd expect to see more than just words. So I mean, like, I hope the best for Sega. Like, I really, as like a fan of the Genesis and the Dreamcast, with like a ton of awesome arcade games, it's like, I just really like to see a place where Sega can get back to the creative force that they were before, and not one that is like really highly reliant on like 2 games that really float the company.
And sort of floating on name recognition in many ways. Not to say the games are necessarily bad. Many of them are actually quite good. Like, I enjoyed Sonic Team Racing, the kart game, but it wasn't as polished as Mario Kart. And it was fun for a bit, but it was not, it didn't feel like the quality of Sega from that we were used to growing up, when they were like really pushing the envelope and fighting, it felt like.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that came from the arcade space, as you mentioned, which is like, all like the best Dreamcast games were ports from arcade games. House of the Dead,
Soul Calibur,
Rally, Soul Calibur, though that's a Namco game.
But then,
and so on. And it was like the beginning of the death for good Sonic games.
Yeah.
That's when Adventure came out, which was interesting. Adventure 2 was not as good, and then it got real rocky after that.
I mean, even Adventure 1 was... This is where I remember playing Adventure 1 and being like, that first level in Adventure 1 is like, it's fantastic. It is full of moments, and it feels fast, and you feel like you're playing Sonic in 3D, and it's awesome. And then you get to like level 2 or 3, and you end up just walking around in 3D, and it feels like a silly Mario or Banjo-Kazooie play-alike. It's like similar to those games, but not as good.
Yeah.
It looked really nice at the time because it was the Dreamcast, 128-bit, whatever. It was like really looked great. But it gameplay-wise was fairly devoid of anything that felt like meaningful.
Right. Right.
So,
well, best of luck to
Sega.
Sega. Like, I hope their super game is actually a super game, but
yep.
I guess I'll have to wait and hear more. I mean, we'll update with more news as we hear it. So,
yeah.
Let's move on to the next topic. PlayStation Stealth drops the PSVR2 release date. Do you want to talk about that one?
Sure. Yeah. So, Sony. We're back to Sony here. We've covered a bit of the PSVR2, and it's been an interesting thing here. So, to really quickly cover the details, Sony yesterday or the day before, I think 2 days ago, announced the price of the PSVR2, some of the accessories, and the the release date. And the release date is going to be February 22nd, 2023. So 3 months away now, 4 months away, basically. It will also retail for $549 just for the headset and controllers, or one set of the two controllers. It will also come with an optional package that includes the Horizon VR game for an extra $50. Excuse me. It will include a download code for
as
for
most
that
of
game.
Sony's bundles do, mind you.
Right. Yeah, they're not necessarily going to get they sort of need to, right? Because they don't know if you have the disc or non-disc version.
Yeah, so they just do digital codes now.
Yep. And I assume that they want to just go to fully non-disc system at some point. It would.
E-waste too.
It would be less waste in a lot of ways. Better for Sony because you wouldn't be able to have you'd cut GameStop right out of the equation.
Yeah.
You also have the PlayStation VR headset. What is it? The charging station for $50. One word.
Yeah.
It slots in, and the controllers. So it's like a $50 accessory that you can get. So that's sort of the big announcement. What we're sort of interested in here is this trend from Sony to do these relatively large announcements just via blog entries, effectively. This is major technology from them. It's more expensive than their core console. And it's sort of an investment in the technology and theoretically the future of this interaction. And it is, to an extent, a competition with Facebook, or excuse me, Meta, and Valve with the Steam Index, I should say, or the Valve Index for their own VR headset. So it's interesting that we're starting to see. This also rolls over into God of War Ragnarok, which also has a release date and a price point and all the versions have been released. Those were also announced via blog entry.
Yeah, and like the last like proper like Sony showcase for that was a year ago, I think, at this point. So
where they did even they had the summer games thing, and I don't know that I don't recall if they showed any. There certainly wasn't anything like
they had a full trailer that had the release date and everything else with it. Yeah,
right. So they didn't have anything that was sort of so remarkable that people are like, oh, Sony just stole the whatever. It wasn't this big, huge announcement that came out.
Yeah, I mean, for a while, like Sony's been praised about with new titles having like these showcase pieces that are usually like a year out from the game's release, where they go, we're going to show you 10 minutes of gameplay, and it gives you a really good idea of what you can expect, and it's worked really well with. I think they've been doing it since The Last of Us, really. When the first Last of Us, that's how they announced the game. They showed like 10 minutes of gameplay footage. So you went from like.
While Justin's drinking, I'll quickly cover the prices of these things. The total cost of ownership with the discless PS5 is going to be $950 just for the headset and the consoles. Valve's Index is $750, plus you need a mid-size PC at least in order to power it and play games that connect to it. And then Meta's Quest 2, the current sort of more non-business focused, actual consumer, large consumer market targeted headset is $399, which is $400, but is also considerably less powerful than either the Valve's Index or the PSVR2. Now, it is priced at a more consumer-friendly, grab it, buy it, experience it, grab and go price point, but it still won't support the types of experiences that both the Index and the PS5, the PSVR2 will.
Yeah, I mean, it slots in like that prosumer range where, yeah, like spec for spec, like it's more in line with the Valve Index, but it prices much lower than the Valve Index. All said and done, not only the headset pricing is much lower, but the additional cost of having like $1,000
system
PC
to power it.
Yeah. Whereas Facebook's Meta Quest 2 is certainly like $400 in your in kind of. You don't really get much with it, but like the Quest as a platform is run by a mobile processor for the visual experience, unless you plug it into a PC, and it has far less bells and whistles, like the lower resolution screens, doesn't have eye tracking, doesn't so on and so forth.
The closer headset to what Sony is in the PSVR 2 would be Meta's Quest Pro, which they just announced. But I mean, it's Quest Business. It's not focused. Their intent. It's $1,500 for the headset.
Yeah, it's $1,500, and I still think the resolution's not even.
It's not
with Sony's.
It's in the ballpark, but it is less. It is a lower resolution. It's in the ballpark. It does have eye tracking.
It has eye tracking. It uses different types of lens style. And I think the motion tracking and stuff like that for your hands is very similar. But I mean, I think as you're saying, is like the oddest part is that for such a large, brand new piece of hardware that should be getting, they should be like stirring people up and getting people like curiosity peaks. They're stealth dropping. Like they didn't give it like I think everybody was expecting like a fall showcase that was going to show off God of War, new games, and a VR headset. I mean, I've been saying it for a while, and they still don't. Like we still don't know what to expect for 2023, and meanwhile, you get all the announcements that you'd expect for the headset to come in a thing like that, all dropped via blog posts, which is just...
There was a companion post as well where they posted the game, like some 17 games or something, some big list of games. They said, here's the big games, and they showed, they had interviews with some of the developers, and they had trailers for most of there's at least a selection of the games that they had there. Here's the experiences you can expect with PSVR 2. And they did all that in a blog entry. It was another thing. These are the things. Taking these two things combined is what you would expect from some sort of E3, or bring in the historically, it would have been bring in the journalists, the people who are in magazines and gaming websites, have them come in, sit down. We're going to give a presentation and showcase. Here's all the trailers for these games. You can play them with the dev kit in the back to experience them and write up something. And that's gone. At this point, we don't even have from a year or two ago where I would have expected that we get a big state of play type thing where Sony says PSVR2 is coming next year, release date. And then they say, here's the games, and they go show like 8 to 10 games where it's like, here's the cool stuff. Then they show the price at the end. They reiterate the date, they show the price, and they say, get ready. Pre-orders open November 15th. That was the other thing.
Yeah. They
did mention pre-orders are going live this month. But they didn't. They just said, we're going to just put it on a blog. It's fine. I guess they're getting enough interest there that they don't have to put any money into the marketing anymore, and it just sort of markets itself. Maybe? Do you think that might be an aspect of this, or is there something else going on?
I mean, there's two going theories. The more likely theory is that due to hardware constraints and due to probably a lack of available games at launch, plus a February 23rd, I think it's February 23rd launch date.
22nd.
22nd.
2023.
it's it doesn't behoove them to try to make a big push on this. It's after the holiday season. Like there's not like you make big pushes towards the holiday to get people to buy things during the holiday when people do most of their consumer spending, and it seems to me that like they don't want to position themselves like that. They want to go, nope, the hardware's available. Enthusiasts, we do not need to say anything more than we currently do because they'll buy it anyways. This is the lowest barrier of entry for high-end VR gameplay.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a handful of games already. We know that Resident Evil and Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 7, uh, Resident Evil 8, I should also
Village,
say.
yeah.
So 7, 8, and 4 are all getting VR counterparts in some capacity, which was shown at TGS. So like they don't need to sell it any more than that, and they probably don't want to sell it any more than that because they're going to be dealing with hardware constraints that they're probably like, you know, if there is too much demand, we can't fulfill it anyway. So, you know, why do that? Let's prepare for
spend a lot of money to get a lot of potential customers upset because they can't find one.
Yeah, not only that, I think the other part of it too is that like VR helmets don't sell themselves very easily.
Yeah.
Right? It's like Wii, right? Like the Wii when it came out did not do well, right? Like the Wii's first like month did not see record sales. It was competing against the PS3, and actually I think they had release dates that were very close to each other, if not like within the same week. And it was the PS3 that was selling off shelves, and the Wii was not. But as people started seeing what the Wii actually was and the novelty behind it, is when people are like, "Oh, I'm actually interested in that." And that might be an also aspect of this strategy, which is you can't properly sell a PSVR headset until people you know are using it, or you're watching streamers use it, and then that's what's going to drive the interest in the platform.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to do right now with where we're just coming out of all the like I mean, PS5 is still sold out everywhere.
Yeah, so, and the only reason why it's probably going to be available this holiday is because they've been like
holding back a bunch. Yeah. Maybe this will be the last time that we see that, and next year we'll actually anyone who wants a PS5 will be able to grab one. I guess what they may not want to do is repeat that with the PSVR2. On that note, to sort of back that up a bit, the PSVR2 is also only going to be pre-sold in the United States and many Western countries on PlayStation Direct, on their website. Which, you know, that we'd seen, there was a lot of the bad press that came out of the PS5's, you know, shortage early on was from people who were having really bad experiences because Walmart's website was falling over. Right. And Amazon was falling over and GameStop was falling over, and they were causing people to have like, I had it in my cart and it said you've been purchased, and then they send me an email and saying, oh, we've rescinded it and we never charge your credit card.
Yeah,
you know, it's just really bad experience. But Sony's setup didn't have that as bad because they figured out a way that would have a queuing system.
I feel like it was the only system out there that had a reliable queuing system. That also didn't gouge you like GameStop.
Right.
Like GameStop was like, we're adding $200 of extra stuff on that you have to buy in order to
if you want to buy a PS5, you have to spend all this extra money to do it. Yeah.
So PlayStation Direct was the most reliable way of getting it. I mean, even me, I was able to get 5 different people PlayStations.
Yeah, you were really lucky with the waiting on until you needed one.
Until I needed one, then I couldn't. That was like I think the first wave of shortage, where like it was like a month where they just really weren't supplying much. Yeah, so they may be avoiding like that situation. They likely have supply constraints that they have to deal with. Like I cannot imagine the assembly of the PSVR headset as being something easy. It uses high-end OLEDs, stuff of that nature. It's just like, it's not going to be the easiest thing for them to have in wide supply. So they're just probably going like, we don't need to worry about properly advertising this until next Christmas. So, you know, like until next September or October, like that's when we'll care about making sure people know about it and that it's stocked up. But until then, we know that it's enthusiasts that will have it. They probably learned this lesson from the PS5, where the people who were getting PS5s were generally enthusiasts.
Yeah. It could also be that they're looking at it and saying, you know, the PSVR 1 was not a huge it had a niche market that it found and a niche customer base. We expect the PSVR2, at least initially, we have no reason to believe that it's going to be all that much different. That could be a thing. An aspect here is that looking at past sales figures of the initial version, it did have a strong, like a loyal following, people who had the PSVR and liked it, really liked it, and wanted to keep that going. And a lot of them have been expressing their desire for the PSVR 2. But, it's hard to say how well it's going to sell outside of as an add-on that costs more than the base console.
Right.
At least the United States market, where we in the US benefit from the gluttonous economy, where the PS5 is basically $100 cheaper than any other market.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Either way, I find I will actually bring up another theory that some people are talking about.
Sure. Yeah.
Totally unfounded, but it does have a bit of sense to it, which is Sony has avoided, largely in this past half year, any real major announcements because of the ongoing lawsuits they have going against Xbox. Not actually, they don't have lawsuits, but they're trying to make an argument as to why Microsoft shouldn't buy Activision, and it's because of their exclusivities and etc. And them showing off all the exclusives that they have and their timed exclusives and all that stuff works against their core argument. Yeah. Even though I think their argument's founded, I think this just doesn't help them if they have these big showcases that shows like how great their first party studios are. And so they've largely gone in stealth mode, which is true. Like they have gone in stealth mode. They really haven't been doing the PlayStation events that they usually do during this time of year. And the suggestion is they're doing it because they need regulatory bodies working against Microsoft to stop the Activision purchase to happening. And their arguments will be undermined by themselves if they have these big press events about how many exclusives they get. So,
nefarious.
Yeah. Well, nefarious, but like also like, yeah, it makes sense. Like they like their legal team is like, do not do this. You cannot do this because we're making a legal argument for you as to why Microsoft shouldn't be able to purchase another enormous publisher.
Right.
And that may or may not be the case, and we would never know because the legal team's not going to be like, yes, we admit to that.
Yeah, I mean, I will also say now that Microsoft has come out on that note, and we'll probably be able to talk about this maybe next week. Who knows? But I think Microsoft did come out and say that they're promising that Call of Duty will always be on PlayStation.
Yeah, I still don't trust it until it's in writing and have like definite terms like. Our annual installment of Call of Duty, as long as we're doing them, will appear on PlayStation platforms in both digital and physical form. We do not commit to, make it available on PlayStation Plus, blah, blah, blah. Like, if they did all that, like, that's where I go, okay. But, like, I mean, as we talked before, Phil Spencer is, like, a master at marketing speak. Yeah. Like, really, really good at it. And it's amazing to hear him say so much with so little. Or say a lot with very few words that makes it seem like it's confirming stuff, but you can say, we'll always have a Call of Duty available to PlayStation, and then on the surface level you're like, oh yeah, you'll always get Call of Duty. Like, what does that actually mean? Which Call of Duties made available? What does that mean? Does that mean they're going to offer it, but Sony can decline? Etc. What are the terms around those statements that they'd have to commit to? And I think that's what I want to see in writing. Until they put something in writing, it's just words that are very cleverly stated to have them not commit to anything specific.
Yeah, maybe they could buy up or everybody from Studio Anoma and build Call of Duty Go. And put that on, which is a great segue.
A little forced, if I'm not to be honest.
You think so?
Yeah.
Oh, bummer. All right.
The last topic we're going to cover is SquareEnix Montreal is shuttered. As I like to say, it was like the Embracer Groups fails to embrace SquareEnix Montreal. But yeah, basically, this whole story comes out of SquareEnix proper. A couple, I don't know, I want to say like 6 months ago, did a very strange thing, and they're like, we're dropping support of our North American studios, and we're selling them to Embracer Group for $300 million. In that group specifically, I think there's one more studio in there that I do not remember, but it's Crystal Dynamics, Eidos Montreal, and Square Enix Montreal. All three of those studios, who've been responsible for quite a few games, got sold off with their core IP that they generated. So that includes like Deus Ex, which was Eidos, Tomb Raider, which was Crystal Dynamics, they're California based. Thief, I think, is in there. Legacy of Kain, Gex. Hitman would have been, but IO Interactive, who worked with, I think, Eidos or Crystal Dynamics, one of those two, they kind of cut themselves out earlier and went independent like a couple of years ago, before the latest Hitman game. But either way, like it's a complete steal for $300 million. Some really strong IP, plus some really strong studios. So that happens. Unclear why. It's a strange move by Square Enix, but I don't know. It seems they were not happy with the performance of any of those studios.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else?
Yeah, I mean, well, just comments on it. No, I'm going to let you finish before I dive in on that.
Yeah, I'll also say that these studios are also were helping develop Hitman, as I said, Guardians of the Galaxy. That was Eidos Montreal, Marvel's Avengers, which was Crystal Dynamics, and Square Enix, which has made the mobile games, but also lent support to development from the Square Enix North American localization and
QA
publishing, QA. So they were kind of a support studio there. So this week, Embracer took action. Well, before that, like 3 months ago, Square Enix, which couldn't be called Square Enix anymore since they weren't owned by Square Enix, announced they had a brand new studio title, and that was going to be called Studio Numa, which I think is named after the obloid space object that was flying around.
Maybe.
I think it is. And that they've actually sent telescopes to take a look at and figure out what it is. I think early on people were like, it might be a spaceship, but it's just an oblong asteroid. Anyways, so they announced their new studio title, and then just this week, Embracer Group's like, actually, Square Enix is gone. Crystal Dynamics, California, and Eidos Montreal sticking around, but the Square Enix team is going to be dispatched and disbanded. Excuse me. And they also mentioned that they were going to be working to take some of this core talent and have them move to other parts of the large Embracer Group umbrella. I'm not sure if they have any other Montreal-based studios besides Eidos, but they are going to probably be taking the top parts of those teams and moving them into other existing studios. I will note that Eidos Montreal and Square Enix occupied the same building, so them collapsing it may be as simple as taking the development team, moving it into their Eidos studio, and then just probably getting rid of like the overhead that was support staff for Square Enix publishing, which was like QA, localization, that sort of thing, and just being like, we don't need this right now. So, anyways, what were you gonna say about the situation?
The whole thing, like how Embracer Group got such a deal from Square Enix. Square Enix had been buying up those studios in order to build out a larger publishing presence with Western style games, understanding that their Square Enix is mostly known for JRPGs, which, while popular, many of them are popular, Final Fantasy in particular with the West, they're not like, they are far, far more popular in Japan and certain Asian countries. Especially within Japan, Final Fantasy has like many mobile versions of games and knockoff like side quest games, and those tend to do a lot better. They're mobile, like the 3DS had like tons of different little Final Fantasy this and that games. Dragon Quest as well. That one does much better in Japan than the West. And this is sort of Square Enix saying we want to be a worldwide publisher. We're going to get these games. We're going to, these really popular games in the West. We're going to learn how to publish to a Western audience. And instead of, learning how to publish to a Western audience, their effect on the studios in the West that they had purchased seemed to be that they were doing less well. They were not managed in a way that was conducive to increasing sales. Eidos Montreal, Crystal Dynamics.
Yeah.
That team with Tomb Raider, I believe they had expectations. At least Square Enix had expectations that the game was those games were going to sell much, much more than they did.
Yeah.
And they, for all intents and purposes, seemed like they should have, given how the quality bar and everything. It was just the marketing teams just could not seem to get the ball rolling on the sales in general. They just weren't able to do it.
I feel like Square Enix struggles to actually advertise their games well. I mean, as much as people were hyped up about Final Fantasy 16, 15, 16.
I don't remember where we're at.
That one's medieval setting. It kind of looks like a weird knockoff of like Game of Thrones. Like, still is advertised in a way that, like, if you're into the gameplay, you get to see a lot of that and see how much the Final Fantasy formula has evolved to adapt to like a more Devil May Cry style gameplay. But man, like the trailers are just bad. Like
they're terrible.
It's full of like these one-liners that are disjointed. So heard in a series, just like, what's going on? Like, I do not understand why I'd be spending 50, 60 hours playing a game that I can't even understand the plot of.
There's no hook. There's no story element. No, I guess it's just ridiculous. And that's Square Enix's sort of tried and true. It works for them in Japan, but not in the West. And they just couldn't they weren't able to fire on all cylinders the way they had hoped to. So it seems as though they were cost cutting because those studios had become a cost center for them instead of a profit center.
Yeah.
And so they were cost cutting. They'd also apparently, they claimed at the time when this happened several months ago that they were going to be refocusing on some NFT blockchain tech. So maybe they're still thinking along those lines. They're enticed by the major investments that were happening in, what's the term there? Crypto finance world.
Oh, yeah.
And specifically the NFT angle, because everyone wanted to say like, NFTs for games is the next evolution of games, which the gaming industry in general and the player base have both sort of, at least today's player base, have both sort of agreed at this stage currently that is not true.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's been a lot of pushback pretty much universally. For that,
a lot of people are now like clamming up to it, although it's not universally the case. But yeah, it's like, finding the easy way to make money is not always easy now that there's been thorough backlash, not just to NFTs, but like, cheap and predatory game mechanics that try to, milk money out of users. I mean, this has been an ongoing thing since people are like, wait, I bought a game and you're selling me more of the game after I bought the game. Like, maybe you should just put that in the game. And it's evolved into, pay $5 for this weapon.
Or a shirt. You can get a new shirt and a hat.
Like, stuff like that. But yeah, so they never got what they wanted out of it. I can understand why they could not manage those companies to save their life, and it became obvious when Marvel's Avengers seemed that it had like a large amount of contention with the way it was developed. I don't know what actually went on there. I don't know who was making the calls, but very clearly there's two games, one of which could have been a decent game, the other one was never fully formed, and they figured that this is like the kind of the Sega situation, which is, well, you got Marvel's IP, just make it an online game that can milk money out of people, and people will love it because it's Marvel. And you're like, lo and behold, that's not true. Like, No matter how strong the
Yeah.
IP is, if the game's not fun, it gets around pretty quickly, and it doesn't matter if your favorite characters in it are in it. You might be able to trick a bunch of kids to buy it, but you're not going to get the long term support you're looking for, and that's what that reeked of. Not sure if it was Square Enix's fault, but clearly Crystal Dynamics suffered from that. Guardians of the Galaxy didn't perform nearly as well, and I think in part because of the stink from Marvel's Avengers on it, which is unfortunate because Guardians of the Galaxy actually is a pretty great game. So yeah, they never got what they wanted out of it. Even with Tomb Raider, when Tomb Raider was released, the first one, they're just like, oh, it underperformed. You're like, what? It sold, whatever, 10 million copies. Like, yeah, underperformed.
Yeah,
like, I don't know what you're expecting the game to do, but 10 million's pretty good for a modern day like adventure game.
But you know what? Maybe the slide. We're loop, Justin. We're looping our topics here. Maybe the slide within Square Enix when they were like, we're gonna buy this studio was like their next game is our next super game.
I mean, honestly, that was 100% the case with Avengers. Like everything about that game seemed like they were trying to make a super game, and they tried to do it from the top down and failed miserably because that's not how things work.
Right.
So, but now Embracer Groups has them, and Embracer, unclear what's going on with them. They have been making a lot of studio purchases. The studios just continue to make games as they normally have, and it just seems like they're like, we can make money this way, and that's it.
Yeah, it does seem with closing Onoma that they are trying to focus on PC and console and just sort of remove themselves from the mobile industry, mobile games, at least insofar as the Go style games are.
Yes.
Right. Like those, I don't know that any of those games were sort of the free to play style where, they make money as a service because they keep updating with new hats or whatever and make you spin for a loot box or something like that.
I mean, those weren't. Those were like straight up
just games,
mobile games, which was like, no, you pay for it and you get a good game.
Right.
But they also weren't like they didn't require the sort of resources that you'd expect from a full size studio either.
Right.
So.
And that's part of the reason why that I assume that's part of the reason why the Onoma Studio had the publisher QA staff on top of their mobile game development staff and localization and everything. They sort of wore multiple hats within the greater Western Square Enix at the time.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine a 200-person company building, surviving off of pay to play, purchase one-off mobile games that go for like $8 or $9 or so, whatever it was. Like you have to sell so many copies of that to pay a 200-person staff of professionals.
Which I mean, it strategically makes sense. Like I know it made big news, but it's just like, why would they? Not only that, like why hold the office space when you don't need half that staff and you already own offices within there?
It honestly may have been part of the calculus of them making this purchase, right? Like they make the $300 million means that each of those studios split equally was $100 million. They may have looked at that and said, no, we only really want two of those because that's where all the IP is and the big game title, those huge AAA development know-how are all in those two. That's where the real value is in this set of three company, at least for them, the way they saw it.
Yeah.
So they may have said like, look, it's 150 million for two companies each, and we'll just jettison the third one because it's not. We're going to look at it, see if there's anything we can salvage, and if we can, great. If we can't, we'll shutter it, and then we'll refocus our energy on those other two. I suspect that's probably more what they had in mind.
I mean, given
150,
that there hasn't been a title dropped, and it's like maybe 6 months after the purchase was made, like, I think the purchase was finalized like 2 months, like less than a month ago, 2 months ago, something like that. Where it was because they announced it like 6 months ago, but it didn't pass until I think just a few months ago. And I mean, them closing it that quickly, probably they had already done the calculus and was just like, nah, there's no point in keeping the studio open in its current form.
Right. Which is a bummer for all the people who had been working there, especially as the markets are all cooling down and layoffs are happening.
Yeah, no, I mean it's
in lots of places.
I mean, on that note, if anybody knows anybody at Square Enix Montreal or Studio Numa, reach out to them, see if they need help. And if you're in the games industry and you're hiring, uh, what's nice about the game industry is we tend to hire back our own. So once like a two studio shutters or there's a massive layoff after a game fails to do well, usually you see a lot of outreach from other studios going like, yeah, we're looking for like talented people. So let us know. And jobs are, keeping people going at least down their chosen career path is usually made available through the support of the game industry. So,
Yep.
Anything else?
I don't think so. I think that sort of covers the angle there. It's just the unfortunate news for that studio, but
Yeah,
from
the holidays or getting
coming up on the holidays. Yeah, hopefully they didn't get any of these details, but hopefully they got a good sort of severance package as part of that shutdown.
Yeah.
So
anyway. All right. Well,
cool.
Thanks everybody for watching this. If you enjoyed this content, like and subscribe. We're on every Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern time, or at least try to be. So follow us, keep an eye out for what we're doing, and I hope you enjoy this.